Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second part of the Introduction to Technology and Innovation. This is also our second module. And so today, what we'll be talking about is about creativity, the connection between creativity and innovation. We'll talk about innovation types, and we'll also talk a little bit about collaboration strategies. Okay, so if we're gonna kind of take a quick review from our previous module, we kind of had a similar figure before, and I'll show that coming up in a little bit. But this is kind of the overview of some of the central ideas that we have, right? You have some kind of opportunity, right? Whoever discovers that opportunity, doesn't matter whether that's an inventor or an inventing team, an entrepreneur, a company, right? They'll do all these various assessments to discover an opportunity, and we'll get to some of these techniques. Then they'll come up with a concrete idea. They're going to do an invention. Not all inventions have to be patented, right? So typically the word invention is related to a patent, but not all of them have to be patented. And these inventions then turn into innovations once we commercialize them. Now you'll see the question mark. There are two circles, and there's another one here. And we'll talk about that question mark going forward. But the idea is really that this is kind of an overview of how our kind of intellectual construct of technology commercialization comes to pass. Where do good ideas come from? You probably, not sure if you had the opportunity to do that video yet with Stephen Johnson, but you will, that's part of the assignment for module 2. But so I just wanted to give you kind of a brief overview of some of the components that come to play into this. All of us have heard the word creativity. It's been used in all kinds of contexts. Here, what we kind of, the definition we'll go with in the class is the ability to transcend traditional ideas, rules, patterns, relationships, or the like, and to create meaningful new ideas, forms, methods, interpretations, etc., etc. And you'll find that on dictionary.com. There's tons of definitions about creativity in all sorts of different contexts. So don't be kind of focused, don't be too fixated on this. The idea is really we want to think about creativity and how does it affect kind of the technology commercialization process. Now, you can imagine, right? There's tons of inputs when it comes to creativity, right? It's information, it's feedback from other people, it's culture, right? So the different cultures have different ways of how to kind of generate new ideas, different, spatial contexts, demographics, experiences, routines, etc., etc. And all these are, of course, connected with each other, right? Outputs. We talk mostly about commercial products and services in this class, but there's artistic work, right? There is decision making options, right? So creativity can have a variety of outputs. And you yourself know this from your own career and life that, people are creative. They come up with new cooking recipes, for example, right? That could be an output. But there's also a question of how does creativity kind of play into the class specifically? And we typically have to kind of look at that. We'll have 3 different perspectives. There's many more perspectives to it, but the 3 main perspectives are individual creativity, team creativity, and organizational creativity, right? So it's probably most intuitive to look at individual creativity first, right? Most of us will kind of experience, spells of creative thinking in one form or another. We can kind of probably intuitively think how teams can be more creative or where teams are not creative, right? We can kind of have a closer connection to that. Where it starts to become more abstract is organizational creativity, right? So how do organizations actually foster creativity, which is one of the main inputs of new inventions and new technology and new innovations, right? They often talk about innovation processes. You in your job will probably have had to go through some creativity workshops, or maybe you did some team brainstorming, right? So these are pretty common techniques and perspectives to think about that. Now, again, if we want to think about what creativity is a function of, right, and these are not exclusive categories, certainly the ability to articulate ideas, right, and everybody has a different way of how to do that. Some people might do that in writing, some people sketch really well, some people communicate this really well, right? So how do I articulate new ideas? That's one of the critical abilities or critical inputs into creativity. Knowledge, obviously, and we'll also know that knowledge can also be a boundary, right? So people that are experts in certain fields have sometimes trouble to see beyond the boundaries of that field, right? Beyond the knowledge base of their field, which is a central reason why we have typically diverse teams in an organization. Style of thinking, right? Sometimes just the way you express things, right? Some people dance, some people do paintings. There's different ways of how to do that, right? And all these ways are legitimate, and all it can, as long as they kind of create and they generate creative new ideas. Personality, motivation, environment, etc., etc. So there's a lot of factors that go into this. And so we have to kind of think about that from that perspective. You can imagine, okay, again, this is not a class on organizational creativity, so I'll keep this relatively short. I'll make sure to add some optional readings to the module if you're interested in kind of looking at that closer. But typically, right, the two main inputs in organizational creativity is the individuals that you select for that organization, right? Their backgrounds, their experiences, their personalities, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have processes and contextual factors that play into this, right? So a team that works for McDonald's is that supposed to come up with new recipes for the menus or new menus in general. They typically have different backgrounds and experiences than someone who, or a team that is supposed to develop a new car, for example. And companies, as mentioned, have different ways to do that. They sometimes have collection systems, right? So suggestion boxes and other things, creativity training programs, but more importantly, and that's typically a little bit more vague, but the word culture, of course, comes into play in many of these cases, is we building a culture of creativity. And again, I'll post some additional readings to that. Again, it's not the focus of the class, but it's an important perspective to take to understand where do good ideas come from, and then what happens to them in terms of the generating an innovation. Many more things than I mentioned here, but certainly fear, right? If I don't like chaos or disorder, I'm overly judgy, right, over other people's ideas and also my ideas potentially. I just have trouble distinguishing reality from fantasy, right? So coming up with good, creative, reasonable, implementable ideas is a challenge, right? And so having the right processes to go with that, that's one of the key issues that we find in companies, which is a big reason why companies buy other companies, right? Because developing innovation capabilities on your own is actually not so easy. And one of the reasons is how do you generate a culture focused on creativity rather than operational excellence and other factors that make companies strong. So I'm not going to show that video because typically it gets flagged when I upload it on YouTube. This is a clip from Apollo 13. I don't know if all of you have watched that movie, But the idea is here, Apollo 13, that it's based on a true story. It was supposed to be another moon mission, and they had some technical issues. And the problem was that the technical issues they had on the spaceship had to be solved by the crew on board, with essentially little to no help by the engineering team on the ground. And so this clip, and you can, if you click on that in your slides, you should be able to get to that video clip. And that's quite entertaining because they have to compromise, they have to kind of improvise, they have to rebuild some of the air filters from existing components. And you can imagine you're on a spaceship and you have to communicate with the crew on Earth, and how to think about that and how to reconstruct. So it's quite an interesting example of creativity under severe limitations. And we're actually pretty good at that, right? So humans are pretty good at being very creative under pressure. And so this is kind of an extreme example. But even in technological innovation, we see, the introduction of deadlines. We see the introduction of hurdles to create kind of a little bit of enough pressure to get people moving forwards. Now we have two different thinking modes. One is called convergent thinking, the other one divergent thinking. And again, you're welcome to look this up online to get more theory behind it. There's a whole branch of things talking about these two things. But essentially what it means is, initially, right, before we kind of figure out what are good options, we want to create as many diverse options as possible, right? And so that's where we want to be we want to be divergent, right? So create as many possible diverse ideas as we can, and then we come up with frameworks and filters and procedures of how we can kind of turn these typically pretty left field ideas into reasonable and feasible possibilities. Okay, and you're welcome to look at that more closely. And so then the question is, right, we have the ideas, how do we convert them into innovations, right? So that's the next kind of step. Typically, if we're looking at universities, right, so we publish a lot of things. If you go to engineering, or if you go to, the physics or math, they generate a lot of new ideas, right? They come up with a lot of new stuff. Not all of these things are patentable. Not all of these things will become innovations. But in this particular context, there is a particular process to how we're going to generate these things. In companies, as mentioned, processes might be a little different, right? So all of you might have seen this go through in one form or another. If we look at inventors, right? So individuals or teams who invent new technologies, they have a particular process, okay? They are very curious, they're questioning a lot of things in the field. There's also a lot of information about other people's methods, tools, and procedures in sciences, right? Because everybody has to publish, and typically you have access to these publications. So you know what people are working on, right? So you can actually, it's an easier process to go through than being in a company where you don't always know what the other company is doing, right? So that's why we've seen a lot of patents coming from the university, because there's a lot of experimentation. And again, a patent is not the same thing as an innovation in terms of the market accepting that technology, right? There's been a lot of technologies coming out of universities that have not been adopted, right? For one reason or the other. So anyway, so this is kind of a perspective. And if we're looking at firms more closely, right? In a lot of firms, you have what's called an R&D department, a research and development department, and they are run differently, right? Different companies have a different R&D culture, and they assign different sorts of resources to these R&D departments. But the idea is typically, right, if you, for example, if you in a drug company, their innovation process is they test a lot of compounds, they work very closely with a lot of universities, right, and typically also recruit researchers from those universities. And then there are teams, commercialization teams, that look at these compounds and say, okay, so this could be a drug and we could commercialize that drug. We have what's called a science push or demand pull, right? And these are relatively important distinctions. Science push means what I just talked about is that we have, a lot of people that are tinkering, they develop new things. They don't always think about the customers primarily, right? They're just doing research, they're just doing, things that they're interested in. And then somebody takes some of these things and tries to build a product, a service, or an innovation out of it, right? So that's why it's called push, because customers are kind of not a priority in these scenarios. Then we have the opposite scenario, right, where companies, they are looking for customer input, right? They're taking customer input and they're using customer input to develop new products. And typically you have most successful companies do a combination of both. And we'll get a little bit more into what's called open innovation in a little bit. But the idea is really, right, we have these kind of two different directions, where one is very customer focused, the other one is typically more technology and feature focused. And you remember this was in module 1, right? I kind of talked a little bit about technological innovation there and kind of the foundations here. Keep in mind, right? So creative processes don't stop when you invent something, right? So the creative process continues because you continue to develop things, you continue to refine things. And so understanding creativity and developing creative potential, that's kind of a key aspect, right, in any commercialization process. And we also talked about this, right? And you can imagine here I showed 3 arrows, but effectively creative processes affect pretty much any part of the technology innovation process in a company, right? It's just you can think about how you're going to creatively get information from customers, how do you going to engage them, how do you develop that technology, right? How do you come up with new ideas, et cetera, et cetera. So creative processes are really key to the innovation process. Here is an example, and you can find that online. You can Google it, okay, no pun intended. But these are some principles that Google has for kind of developing innovations, right? And we talked about culture beforehand. There isn't a lot of companies who are very explicit with the innovation culture, right? What are kind of the principles and how we do things about this. But Google is an example, and this is kind of the way they kind of map things there. All right. So the next kind of subsection here is innovation technologies, which I'll address in the next video.